When Shane Black's The Predator shat on the screens in late 2018, the Predator franchise was seemingly locked in a death spiral from which there was no escape. Each successive iteration had played like a poor man's forgery of the 1987 original, desperately chasing the magic of what John McTiernan had created while lacking the thematic core that had made the Predator so terrifying to audiences the world over, and so enduring within pop culture. No longer the personification of humanity's collective fear that we might not be the dominant species in the universe, McTiernan's once iconic monster had devolved into a cartoonish brute whose only purpose was to show up and cause carnage. It's often said that the original Predator is a slasher film in disguise, and by the late 2010s, the Predator had gone the way of Michael Myers, or probably more aptly, Jason Voorhees before him, a toothless horror mascot. Like all good monster movies, the Predator isn't scary just because he's a big inhuman-looking killing machine. No, he's scary because he represents an idea. Not only does his presence displace humanity from the top of the food chain, but it holds a mirror to the barbarism we often inflict on each other. The Predator, as it's depicted in both McTiernan's original and its underrated sequel, which is largely responsible for establishing most of the lore we associate with the franchise to this day, is a warrior, but it doesn't tend to pick fights with worthy opponents. It picks weaker species that it knows it can overcome. In this way, it's more like a hunter, or, you might say, a predator. And it's this predation that serves as a direct mirror to the film's other protagonists, a squadron of US Special Forces operators. Like the Predator, these uber-macho commandos aren't looking for a fair fight. We watch as they slaughter their way through an underdeveloped Central American country until they finally come face to face with something that can not only withstand their firepower, but surpass it, at which point the hunters become the hunted. But the Predator isn't just karmic retribution for the imperialistic violence of the commandos, it's a reflection of it. Right down to its design, the Predator feels like a slightly exaggerated mirror to the commandos, embodying the same kind of hyper-masculinity as Dutch and Al, and its arrival displaces the commandos at the top of the hierarchy, at which point it proceeds to give them a taste of their own medicine, effectively putting them in the position of the people they had just recklessly murdered without a second thought moments earlier. And by putting the Predator in the position of the United States in this conflict and the kinds of characters who are traditionally depicted as unimpeachable heroes on the receiving end of violence usually reserved for enemies of the United States, the film, at least on some level, forces its predominantly Western audience to confront their support for similar violence around the world. The Predator is to the US Armed Forces what the US Armed Forces are to every enemy they go up against, a belligerent and technologically superior fighting force bearing down on a foe that is in no position to adequately defend itself. It's the story of a predator contending with something that turns their own predation back onto them. And this is a dynamic all the subsequent films also adopt. Whether it's the LAPD in Predator 2, a bunch of mercs, soldiers, and serial killers in Predators, or literally a xenomorph, David's perfect killer in the AVP films.
Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair.
The task of reconstructing the franchise from the ground up fell to Dan Trachtenberg. Trachtenberg understood that, like with Cloverfield, the path forward for the Predator wasn't escalation, but excavation. Instead of trying to recreate McTiernan's Predator, he decided to dig into the core ideas that underpinned that film and use them as a framework to build the franchise out in a bold new direction while remaining true to the spirits of the original. The first entry in Trachtenberg's revival, Prey, does exactly that. Billed as a back-to-basics survival thriller in the same vein as the first film, what makes Prey so effective is how it takes this thematic core of the original film and removes any and all pretense. Instead of centering the film on the perpetrators of imperialistic violence, Prey cuts out the middleman and assumes the perspective of a historical victim of it. Set in 1719 among the Comanche Nation, the film was an exercise in crafting an authentic period piece with the added excitement of dropping a predator into the mix. Here, the Predator is a stand-in for European colonists, a technologically advanced invader who disrupts indigenous life. It simplifies the subtext of McTiernan's original work, taking the Yautja, a ruthless, hyper-masculine apex predator and invasive species that hunt for sport and consumes without regard for the toll it may have on anyone or anything else, and places it at another point in history, all but drawing a through line between colonization and the kinds of imperialism the original was critiquing, while simultaneously proving the series' elasticity. This elasticity was pushed further again in Trachtenberg's follow-up Predator Killer of Killers, an animated anthology which weaved a gorgeous tapestry of interconnected Assassin's Creed-esque stories about warriors and predators clashing throughout history. A Viking leader and her wannabe warrior son, samurai brothers facing off in feudal Japan, a World War II fighter pilot. Each vignette centers on a character from a warrior culture whose aspiration to be an exemplar of their culture's way of life clashes with the ugly and violent reality of living within a warrior culture. This anthology approach proved the franchise's flexibility while using it to further explore the themes Prey had salvaged from the original. All of this experimentation has finally culminated in Predator Badlands, a heavy metal-inspired sci-fi fantasy film in the vein of Conan the Barbarian that takes the series to a place that feels both inevitable and yet unfathomable. With Badlands, the franchise sets its sights on the Yautja themselves at long last, telling a story about the creatures themselves. No longer a proxy for other forces as in previous films, Badlands elects to look inwards and explore the kind of culture that creates a predator. And somewhat miraculously, being a PG-13 movie, it never tries to file the edges off of the Yautja to do so. They're just as ruthless as ever. Instead, it simply presents us with a protagonist who is on the periphery of that culture, yet aspires to be accepted by it, not unlike the protagonists in Killer of Killers. If this whole franchise has been about examining the repercussions of cultures of violence, then Predator Badlands is an attempt to understand how those cultures are perpetuated internally. What motivates that violence, and how does it sustain itself? And perhaps most importantly, can we ever break free of its stranglehold over us? If so, what is required of us to do so? If you're like the Yautja embarking on violent hunts of your own, you're gonna wanna make sure you're in perfect health, and the only way to be sure is to go see a doctor. Frustratingly, finding the right doctor is just as hard as finding the right target. What feels right to you might not feel right to someone else, or vice versa. I feel really fortunate to have found a doctor who is right for me, and with today's sponsor, ZocDoc, you can now narrow down your own search for the healthcare you need as well. ZocDoc is a free website where you can easily search and compare high-quality, in-network doctors so you can find the right doctor for you. Whether you're looking for someone in-network nearby or with specific appointment times, ZocDoc helps you quickly find the right doctor for your needs. No guesswork, no phone calls needed. You can vet each doctor with detailed profiles and verified patient reviews before you ever step into the office. You can even see the doctor's open appointment times, choose one that works for you, and click to instantly book a visit. You can even score same-day appointments, which is kind of insane to think about in today's climate. ZocDoc isn't just for one type of care, and to that end, they have more than 100,000 providers across nearly every specialty, from primary care to dental health, eye care to urgent care to mental health, and more. ZocDoc is the one-stop shop for all your healthcare needs. Plus, it's completely free to use. So stop putting off those doctor appointments, go get yourself a checkup, and make sure everything's all good, because that's the most important thing. Go to ZocDoc.com/FilmSpeak or click the link in the description to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. That's ZocDoc.com/FilmSpeak or click the link in the description below to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. And thank you so much to ZocDoc for sponsoring this video. The decision to center Predator Badlands around a Yautja who isn't accepted within Yautja culture but wishes to be was a stroke of absolute genius, in my opinion. Not only does it allow the film to reveal new dimensions of the culture without showing too much and spoiling the mystique, but it also solves the problem of how to get an audience to connect with a Yautja protagonist. By zeroing in on the runt of a clan, in this case Dek, and then pitting him against not only an infinitely stronger adversary but also his father, the patriarch of his clan, the film manages to make a Yautja feel like the underdog. In its prologue, Badlands firmly establishes the Yautja as a Klingon-esque warrior culture. They're hyper-masculine brutes, not too dissimilar to Dutch in the gang in the original Predator, who value physical strength and emotional stoicism with little regard for life, including those within their ranks who they consider weak or defective. Given that he's a runt and the Yautja cull the weakest among them, Dek is predisposed to be a victim of his own culture. Yet, he's so indoctrinated in their ways that he's desperate to be embraced by it. He thinks he can bootstrap his way into belonging, despite every indication that this simply isn't how things work. The film opens with a quote from the Yautja Codex that reads, "Yautja are prey to none, friend to none, and predator to all." This intense rejection of kinship is rooted deep within the culture and isn't something Dek is likely to overcome, even if he musters the strength necessary to rise above his station. However, it's pretty easy to deduce why Dek holds on to hope despite this. He has an unusually strong relationship with his brother, Quay. Dek and Quay's brotherly bond flies in the face of the Yautja proverb, and it stems from an act of compassion by Dek, who saved his brother's life when they were children. There's a certain irony in the fact that the thing that marks Dek for death, that being his inability to be the quintessential Yautja, is also the thing that kept him alive for so long. Rather than following their father's orders and killing Dek, Quay trains him so that he can take the rite of passage like any other Yautja. Quay is the physical embodiment of what a Yautja should be, yet has an emotional connection with his brother that undermines his standing in the clan. Meanwhile, Dek has the drive and mental fortitude needed to be a great Yautja, but lacks the physicality. But because both brothers are products of their culture, they don't stop to question the unfair reality of it. The goalposts are constantly moving because the culture is built upon an ever-shrinking hierarchy, and everyone within it is fighting to be the one on top. This establishes the mentality, the vicious cycle of violence that Dek must transcend if he wants to survive on his own terms going forward. In a way, Dek is the protagonist Trachtenberg had been working towards throughout his tenure as the key creative voice behind Predator. It's a film that really only works if you've had a whole series of films in which the Predator has been there to pants the other warriors. Now we get to see what happens when you do to the Predator what they do to others. Strip away its advantages and make it the underdog to see what essential qualities remain. What little we're shown of Yautja society exposes a fundamental flaw in their culture. They are a community of individuals, living as a collective but only looking out for themselves. They just tear shit up until their will has been imposed, thus demonstrating their superiority. However, it's precisely this mentality that often works against them. They don't understand or respect the environments they enter or the creatures they hunt, and as we've seen in other Predator movies, that's frequently their undoing. This realization forms the backbone of Dek's character arc. Like every other Yautja or predatory human protagonist before him, Dek enters the story believing he can make his environment bend to his will through brute force, only to learn, somewhat painfully, that isn't how life works, and eventually adjust his thinking to embrace curiosity over dominance, and find strength through unity rather than stubbornly holding on to individualism as a virtue. Badlands draws this line between Yautja hubris and toxic masculinity in order to make a point about the kinds of people who subscribe to this way of thinking. The film argues that this way of navigating the world only leaves you alone, angry, and unfulfilled, until eventually you die a pointless death. I mean, no wonder the Chuds got so mad about this movie, am I right? Yeesh. But getting back to Dek, because the Yautja have cultivated a culture that not only encourages dominance, but expects it, someone like Dek, who is desperate for acceptance, foolishly takes his attempts to assert dominance to the extreme, embarking on a hunt no Yautja has ever returned from, and one not even his father, the ultimate Yautja in his eyes, would dare attempt. But that same drive that makes him dangerous also makes him capable of growth. Thea suggests that perhaps Dek's actions, his commitment to bend his surroundings to his will and claim the trophy he feels entitled to, has less to do with proving his toughness and more to do with the internalized grief from the loss of his brother. What he fails to realize until Thea introduces the idea to him via her story about the wolves is that Quay saw strength in Dek's compassion. Dek's decision to save Quay's life completely reshaped not only his view of Dek, but how he engaged with Yautja culture going forward. It's why he defied the edict laid out in the Codex and sacrificed himself to spare his brother. He didn't aspire to be a great killer, he aspired to be a great protector. Like his younger brother, who he recognized as a true alpha, even if Dek couldn't see it for himself yet. It's a beautiful and somewhat understated development over the course of the film that I feel elevates the movie a great deal. It's ballsy enough to deconstruct toxic masculinity within a franchise steeped in traditionally masculine imagery, but to then pair that with the legitimately uplifting and affirmative example of positive masculinity is just so powerful. But what makes the wolf allegory all the more effective is the way it manifests in the Kalisk storyline. The Kalisk is adaptable, practically indestructible, a feared apex predator sought after the universe over, which makes the reveal that Bud, the little creature companion that accompanies Dek and Thea for a leg of their journey, is the Kalisk's offspring, so fantastic. What we thought was just another brute attempting to subjugate the world around it isn't that at all. It's a devoted mother trying to protect her child. The Callisk doesn't go into an environment and start tearing it to shreds just to prove its dominance. She does so to ensure the safety of her child. Her perceived aggression is an offense, it's defense. This revelation only serves to further prove Thea's point about true strength. Anyone with the will to inflict violence can do so regardless of their strength. Deck may be grieving, but that grief can be the thing that gives him a greater sense of empathy and understanding for the world he's crash-landed on. He has the sensitivity required. He just has to choose to embrace it. By having Deck come to recognize that his natural inclination towards sensitivity is a strength and not a weakness to be suppressed, it allows Badlands to become a complete reimagining of strength, challenging both the Predator mythology and the audience's preconceived notions about what makes one strong. Another interesting dynamic at play in Badlands is the contrast between the primal nature of the Yautja and the dispassionate disposition of Weyland-Yutani. In a funny way, both parties kind of embody the spirit of their respective franchises, which are once again thrust together, albeit in a much more deliberate manner this time around. Trachtenberg astutely recognizes that Predator and Alien exist at opposite ends of a continuum. On one end, you have Predator, which is rooted in extreme individualism. From the Yautja to the macho protagonists of the original films, Predator is about individuals in a struggle for dominance, effectively making their culture a microcosm of the franchise itself. Conversely, Alien primarily deals with extreme collectivism. Weyland-Yutani is this seemingly infinite corporate entity that everyone we ever meet seems to serve in some capacity. Everyone plays their part to further the collective cause, and even though the cause ultimately benefits a select few at the top, very little time is spent dwelling on that reality. Even the xenomorphs belong to a collective, with offspring serving a queen like ants or bees. But it's the synthetics that most embody this ethos of blind collectivism because they are literally property of the corporation they serve, designed to carry out their directive without a second thought for themselves or anything that would prevent them from achieving their goal. Much like the way the film is skeptical of the Yautja's dogmatic individualism, Badlands also frames the collectivism of the synthetics as problematic. The synths are devoted to a shared cause, but it's a cause they do not benefit from. The sense of community that has been instilled in them by Weyland-Yutani is insincere, but the absurdity of it all is cranked up to 11 when you remember that these are synthetic people created by the company. Why would you need to lie to them about their exploitation? Well, because they developed their synths with emotions so that they could in turn use them to understand and exploit other beings on behalf of the company. And because of this, the company has to use the same tactics the synths use on alien worlds to manipulate them. However, the problem for Weyland-Yutani is that they've created beings with the capacity for empathy, but they expect that empathy to be a one-way street. They want the synths to feel emotionally connected to the company, but the company doesn't reciprocate that empathy. Instead, it treats them as disposable. But empathy can't be a one-way street. It's all well and good to create a being capable of empathy, but sooner or later, it will expect and seek out reciprocation. That's why Thea sought it from her sister Tessa. The relationship between these two synthetics is practically the film's emotional core. When the Callisk attacked their base, both sisters experienced a deep trauma that brought their underlying emotional bond to the surface. But where Thea is left to fend for herself, bolstering her feelings of affection towards her sister, Tessa is thrust back into the cold, manipulative hands of Mother, who quells that instinct with her and reaffirms her devotion to the company and the cause, instilling her with a rigidity not all that dissimilar to the Yautja's inflexible warrior code, which is why it's pretty unsurprising when she confesses she agrees with their belief in culling the weak. When Thea first enters the story, she's still more like her sister than not, manipulating Deck to get herself back to her base so she can reunite with Tessa and presumably complete their mission. But over the course of her travels with Deck, she goes through a kind of deprogramming. While her sister is having her loyalty to the company drilled back in, Thea is replacing it with her newfound kinship with Deck and Bud, and her ever-strengthening love for Tessa. And although she briefly relapses, disillusioned by Deck's callous abandonment of Bud, she's still possessed by the idea that life could be more than what she was programmed to do. While Deck is learning to open himself up to empathy and community, Thea is learning to put herself first a little more. While she doesn't abandon community, she learns to embrace a community that embraces her back, rather than a company that just takes and takes without ever giving in return. Dec and Thea's parallel journeys away from the extremes that define their respective cultures over the course of the film almost plays like a proxy for the gradual synthesis of the Predator and Alien franchises. Much like Dec, Thea, and Bud, who end the film having become their own makeshift clan, one that isn't fractured by the aggressive individualism of the Yautja nor the exploitative faux collectivism of Weyland-Yutani. Something new. A chosen family built on a foundation of respect rather than hierarchy or programming. It stands to reason then that a planet like Genna would be the crucible in which these two are forced to reconsider their worldview, because more than any other environment we've seen in this franchise, Genna is resistant to any and all attempts to change it. Unlike the jungles of the original Predator or the urban environment of Predator 2, this alien world cannot be conquered or colonized, only survived. And the best way to survive it isn't to fight, it's to understand. I don't think anything makes this point clearer than the sharp contrast between Genna and Yautja Prime. Yautja Prime, much like its inhabitants, is a cruel, unforgiving place, a barren, resource-depleted desert scarred with jagged protrusions and sparsely populated by organisms that exist solely to be hunted by something bigger and meaner. But Genna is different. Unlike Yautja Prime, Genna is lush and rich with life. It's just as unforgiving, but the flora and fauna on Genna feel defensive. Genna is a planet built to punish interlopers who don't know how to navigate its diverse biomes. Meanwhile, the native wildlife all exist in harmony. The native species like the Callisk and the bone bison have developed hardened exteriors so that they can pass through the lethal terrain unscathed. Instead of continuing his futile efforts to overcome the environment, Dec leverages his experience, traversing the wilderness to fashion himself a set of weapons and armor so that he can join the planet's fight to repel the intruders decimating its lands. There's something almost video game-esque about the way Dec's development is depicted. Every beat in his journey feels like it's designed to level up his character in some respect, the way one would in a video game, to the way Dec gets one fight with his full arsenal before it's taken away from him, and he's forced to rebuild his inventory have a distinctly video game feel to them, while the presence of a non-human sidekick riding around on Dec's back feels reminiscent of a platformer mascot like Ratchet & Clank, Jak and Daxter, or Banjo and Kazooie. Even the film's approach to environmental storytelling evokes the storytelling in a Naughty Dog or Bethesda game. Characters frequently observe and or interact with objects scattered throughout the environment to unlock new information about the world and acquire skills that you will later be required to master to beat the final levels. Even if I didn't know for a fact that Dan Trachtenberg directed a Portal short and is a massive gamer and that his directorial style is heavily informed by his love of video games, the medium's influence on this film would be hard to miss. Which is why I'd argue Predator Badlands belongs in the pantheon of greatest video game movie not based on an actual video game, right alongside the likes of Avatar, Upgrade, and Overlord. A ridiculously rad, wholly immersive sci-fi fantasy experience that channels the very best of early AAA gaming through the lens of sprawling sci-fi adventure movie, the kind Hollywood seldom makes anymore. From the moment the film begins, it feels less like watching a movie and more like being dropped into the best single-player open-world game ever developed. And what makes all of this feel so noteworthy to me is that all of these homages to the visual manager of video games doesn't feel surface level the way it does in many direct video game adaptations. These devices aren't gimmicks for Trachtenberg, they're just another tool in his inventory. He's employing the storytelling grammar of games into his work because, as a self-professed lifelong gamer, it's foundational to the way he conceptualizes the stories he wants to tell. It felt like watching the next generation of filmmakers find their voice. Filmmakers who grew up playing cinematic video games and therefore channel that storytelling grammar into their work instinctively. It's the same feeling I got watching something like The Creator or some of Neil Blomkamp's work. These are artists who are equal parts the students of cinema and the emerging art form of video games. It's the reason Badlands evokes a very specific era of gaming, that PS2 to PS3, Xbox 360 era of AAA games like Gears of War and God of War. It's because those are the games Trachtenberg would have grown up playing. And this particular era of gaming is a perfect fit for Predator in particular because games of that era were steeped in the same gritty, violent machismo that Predator as a character embodies. It's a real full circle moment. It's so goddamn cool. A film that pulls from games that in turn pulled directly for the roided out badasses of the 80s that Predator was designed to lampoon.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
Predator Badlands truly feels like the inverse of a movie tie-in game. It's a game tie-in movie to a game that doesn't exist, but feels like it should. But unlike the movie tie-in games of old, this was made with considerable care. And that's really the best way to describe the film overall. The best feeling in the world when watching a movie is realizing someone put incredible care in every single decision being made, and I got that feeling multiple times while watching Badlands. It's a testament to how far a good idea and the passion to do it right can take you, even within the parameters of a franchise as seemingly played out as Predator.
Shit happens.
Predator Badlands achieves what seemed impossible just a few years prior. It makes this franchise feel vital again, and it did it by being unafraid to shake things up. In fact, shaking things up seems to have been a requirement. There's a misconception that so many legacy projects like this turn into empty slop because the creatives behind the camera lack an appreciation for the franchise they're contributing to, that they aren't reverent enough, but more often than not, it's the opposite. It's unchecked adoration that holds these franchises back. Filmmakers who are so precious about the property that they hold themselves back at every turn and hesitate to test even the softest of boundaries. But Dan Trachtenberg? Nah, dude, he ain't that guy. It's clear looking at all three of the Predator films he's made so far that while he has love for Predator, he's not interested in simply paying homage to it. Instead of looking at the franchise like a fan, he's looking at it as a creator and seeking out new and interesting ways to approach the material. He isn't just a student of Predator, he's a student of cinema, and of art more broadly, whether that be games or comics or what have you, and he's drawing on all of these different influences to continually add new dimensions to the franchise. Each subsequent project has shown just how elastic this franchise can be, and instead of resting on its laurels after each experiment, Trachtenberg seems to strive to up the ante even more the next time. While his films are deeply informed by the wider lore of the Predator, but he never becomes a prisoner to the mythology or to people's expectations of what a Predator movie can and can't be. Not unlike Deck, he uses these trappings as a tool in service of a loftier goal. In the days after seeing the movie, I kept trying to figure out what Dan Trachtenberg's approach to Predator reminded me of, and then I came across a headline about how James Cameron had given feedback on the film, and it hit me. It's Aliens! Part of the reason Aliens turned out as phenomenal as it did is because old Jimmy C had no interest in recapturing Ridley Scott's Alien. He had an idea for a sequel that was totally its own thing, and he made it happen. And by God did it work, proving right out the gate that Alien didn't just have to be one thing forever. Across his trilogy of films, Dan Trachtenberg has shown that Predator can be just as versatile as Alien, and in Badlands, he finally gave it its Aliens, a film that completely flips the script and takes the franchise into wholly uncharted waters, while still showing audiences a damn good time. With Badlands, Trachtenberg chooses evolution over stagnation, and in doing so, he delivers something truly rare. A franchise film that feels genuinely new, genuinely dangerous, and genuinely alive. The hunter became the hunted, and now he's become something else entirely. A survivor, a bridge between worlds that were never meant to meet. Not unlike the film itself, which reunites two of cinema's greatest science fiction franchises in a way that finally feels organic. This is the future of franchise filmmaking, and it's more alien and yet more human than we ever could have imagined.